To whom much is given, much is required. Part of that requirement is sharing. Culture is the heartbeat within our lives, and it's at the core of so many things. While we live in a time when we are starving for wisdom, I welcome you to your wisdom retreat at Culture Raises Us. Dr. Caprice Hollins is today's guest, and she is the co-founder of Cultures Connecting, which is an organization dedicated to addressing racial and cultural divides. She has over 25 plus years experience in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space as a leader and change agent. You know, I'll let her expand on this shortly, but before we do so, we'll always start with our signature question. And when you hear culture, what does that mean to you?
One of my favorite definitions that I heard in graduate school is culture is what everybody knows that everybody knows. So culture is a way that people engage, communicate, how they celebrate, what gatherings look like, how they, what values they hold. And a culture often depends on our different identities. So there can be like a culture amongst people with disabilities or a culture amongst women. And that it never means that everybody from a particular group shares that same cultural norm, value, or way of engaging. So one way I also talk about this, Aster, is as a biracial woman, I identify racially as Black because that's what my experiences are. But culturally, I identify with some things that align more with white culture, like time, certain ways of how much information I give to other people, how much I share, and some ways that I show up align more with Black culture. So it's not uncommon for Black people to interrupt when they're talking, telling story and getting loud and, interrupting and just getting really excited. And in white culture, there's often the take turns that interrupting is rude. And so a lot of times people of color end up leaving themselves behind because they learn the rules that you don't interrupt, when really my interrupting is just my eagerness or my excitement, right, about the topic. So no one says, hey, let's all be late to that party. But whenever I have a birthday party and I'd invite my white friends and my friends of color, right, I'd say it's at 9:00 and all my white friends would get there before me and all my friends of color knew, right? We'll go up later.
Right. Well, what we're not going to do is associate lateness with a Black folk and then the white folk get there on time. But I do hear what you're saying, right? That the nuances and the differences, and it's interesting that you make the correlation to cultures as opposed to behaviors or values, right? Which I think can go across different cultures and don't necessarily get associated to a culture. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and some behaviors like time, right? This casualness associated with time do end up holding value, right? So the dominant culture then decides how professionalism, for example, is defined. So being on time is a professional kind of white cultural norm. But maybe being on time for me, for another culture, could depend on, well, do I have children? Did I have to catch the bus? And so this value around time gets lifted up and there's no grace for, well, there might be some reasons why.
That's right.
People are not showing up on time.
That's right. That's right. Time for me is one of those things where if I am on time, I'm late. If I'm early, I'm on time. And that's something that I try to instill even in my girls. But to your point, there's so many different nuances and reasonings behind them. As I already hear you speak, I'm learning so much about maybe even your journey a little bit. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about your journey to date and kind of what led you to this advocacy work in this space and cultures connecting.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just add one more thing about time? What's interesting is there's also a generational culture
Yeah,
around time,
agree,
right?
agree.
So the older generation, you don't show up 10 minutes early, you're late.
That's right.
The younger generation, I'll be there on time and that's when I'm clocking in and that's when you start paying me, right? So that's the nuances,
Right.
right?
Right.
Uh, yeah. So my mom's white. My older brothers and sisters are white from my mom's first marriage. Myself and my younger sister are both biracial, black and white. And I didn't start talking about race until graduate school. Really no conversations. I always knew that race mattered. I always knew that my race mattered. I just didn't have any place to talk about my experiences. And so I go off to graduate school, I'm getting my doctorate in psychology. I'm minoring in multicultural and community psychology, which is essentially now diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I am blown away, Aster, by these conversations that our professors are having with us, right? Every course, the professors were evaluated on their ability to infuse multicultural content into the curriculum. So it didn't matter if we were taking psychopathology, statistics, couples counseling, it all looked through a lens of diversity, not just race, but class, ability,
Yeah,
age,
absolutely.
religion.
Thought.
And yeah, absolutely. So they're trying to help us develop an equity lens so that we didn't, and we'll maybe talk about this later, but so that we didn't, as therapists, engage our clients from a colorblind place,
Sure.
right? Someone's in a wheelchair, you don't want to pretend like they're not in a wheelchair or that doesn't inform a part of their life. And I am, for the first time, having this experience of recognizing that, wow, I have bias. I stereotype, or that I have privilege. That one was really a shock for me. This idea that, sure, I might identify racially as Black. I can experience some racism, but my experiences are not the same, let's say, as yours, as a darker skinned Black person, as a darker skinned Black man, right? And I, what would I say? I started to experience liberation, not right away. First, there was defensiveness, grief, anger, shame, guilt, all of these different emotions. But as time was going on, I realized that really this was the path to my essentially, I don't know what other word, liberation.
And purpose.
Huh?
And purpose.
Well, I didn't know. I still thought I was going to be a therapist.
Okay.
I still thought I was going to be a therapist. But this freedom that I had to now, talk about how I've colluded with racism, talk about how I've been socialized, instead of walking around the world like, oh, I don't stereotype, because I thought that because my family was so diverse, I've got a brother that's gay, stepmom from Thailand, right? My Black grandparents adopted my white mom. All of that became proof for me that everybody else had work to do, but I didn't. And so seeing myself as a part of the work and leaning into those hard places, was where, again, that freedom and liberation. And I wanted other people to experience it too, quite frankly. Like, wow, I never operated under colorblind thinking, but I knew that was a thing.
Right.
And know the liberation that people can have in that, like how hard people have to work to pretend they don't notice. It's often white people, but not always.
Right.
Or how I work to pretend like I wasn't stereotyping people who are gay because my brother is gay, or stereotyping white women because my mother was white, to be able to shift from that to, yep, me too. So that if you said something to me, like, Caprice, I noticed that you are, making some assumptions about me, rather than being defensive, to be able to say, Aster, tell me more about that.
That's right.
Like, because I'm curious now, I wasn't always, to see what I couldn't see in myself before,
That's right.
because I can now work on it, right? After the ignoring or seeing that everybody else has work to do, you don't grow, you don't improve, you don't become the best version of yourself that is possible for you to be in this lifetime.
Yeah, and you talk about you've used this word liberation a number of times in your description, and I think it's also this notion of these courageous conversations on race that are very central to the work that you're doing. How do you navigate these kind of discussions effectively? And what I mean by effectively, there's so many times you're going to be in these spaces where there may be resistance that you're talking about and a lack of accountability or reality of the implications of systematic, institutional, structural racism and oppression. Like, how do you navigate those courageous conversations?
Yeah, that's a whole book, Aster. Well, seriously,
Yeah,
we're working on our second edition
yeah.
right now. It really is a whole book, and I will say, to tie it into, the question that you asked me earlier, I will say that anyone who wants to or is facilitating these conversations cannot do it effectively if they're not doing personal work.
Mm,
So when I'm doing my personal work and I see myself as a part of this journey, so let me back up and say, I don't see myself as an expert. I see myself as someone having expertise. I don't know that we can ever arrive, so to speak, when it comes to, people trying to lead race conversations, but I am learning and growing with them. And I always tell my participants, I'm going to share with you what I know, and then I'm going to learn. I'm sure I'm going to learn from you too. So when I keep doing the personal work and someone shows up who is resistant, or someone shows up in a way that has thinking that is embedded in marginalization or othering, if I can see myself in some way reflected in that person, it's going to be easier for me to meet them where they're
yeah.
at. Right. And the longer I do this work, sometimes the harder that is, because I can forget how hard it was for me. Now, I always knew racism existed. All I shared with you is that I was having formal conversations about it for the first time.
Mhm.
So the further along I go in my journey, sometimes the harder it is for me to remember. Look, Caprice, do you remember when you didn't realize that you had privilege? Do you remember when, you thought you didn't have bias? Don't forget about last week when you were stereotyping that Black man or that Latino woman. And so the more I do that personal work, again, the easier it is, and easy, I don't use that word much in these conversations, the more effective, let me say that I will be in meeting that person where they're at. And that can be the person of color who says, I don't think race is an issue. That can be a trigger for me, right?
Yeah.
Or a white person who says, I'm colorblind, or what about all lives matter, right? And so the moment that I get triggered, right, I'm like, okay, Capri. So that's one thing. I'll tell you another thing that we teach in our workshops is a strategy, Aster, of asking questions with genuine curiosity.
Mhm.
So what my brain will do is, when someone says something that is embedded in white supremacy culture, I will think like, I already know why you said that. I already know why you think that way. And then my brain will automatically label them. So that's my old brain. And I'm exercising my new brain to go to curiosity. Tell me more about where you're coming from with that. How did you understand? Um, how did you come to understand it that
That's
way?
very much the therapist element right there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And you know what, Aster, in the beginning, I used to get my evaluations. It felt like therapy. And since that wasn't what I was going for, I really had to work on the questions that I asked so that I didn't keep peeling back layers. Right. And so now I just kind of keep the questions to the surface, and then I wait to educate after I get a better sense of where that person is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
This way, I'm going to say what needs to be said rather than all that could be said, right? If I jump right into educating, I'm going to say everything that I know to say about that topic.
That's right.
I'm also, even if I do it nicely, you're going to feel a little bit of shame around it as I bestow upon you my knowledge, right? Versus a little bit harder, stop, breathe, Caprice, take a deep breath, ask some questions, right? Connect.
Listen, you said so much in that, and I'm always curious on what defines success in this space, because it's very subjective, for sure at times. How do you measure now the impact of your interventions in promoting this racial justice within organizations? And do you have an example that kind of encapsulates this?
Yeah, yeah. So I hear two questions in that, and if I forget the other one, remind me.
Mm-hmm.
In a workshop, success is people risking to have their voices heard, people being willing to speak it messy or speak it in draft, not waiting until they get it perfect. People who maybe are used to talking about race or more comfortable with the discomfort of having these conversations, taking the risk to not have their voices be heard so that other people can share their thinking. So there's sometimes a lot of silence, just waiting,
Mm-hmm.
really encouraging people to share their thoughts and experiences, because the goal, I mean, I always have an objective, like maybe I just got finished doing a workshop and the objectives, two of the objectives was that they would learn what microaggressions are and they'd be able to identify them. That was
Okay.
two of them. But the other goal that I always have is that we're going to learn how to have hard conversations together.
There you go.
So aside from whatever topic I'm teaching them, we've got to learn how to have conversations that we weren't taught to have with one another, right? So even if people of color know that racism exists, they understand how it's influencing their lives. Maybe they even understand institutional and systemic racism. That doesn't mean that they know how to engage white people. So I always, have this little joke where I say, I might go to Astor and say, Astor, you're not going to believe what this white woman said to me today.
Mm-hmm.
But can I engage that white woman in a way that helps them, that plants some seeds, that gets them to thinking? And for white people who are very afraid, not all of them, some want to be seen as a racist, but the majority of people that I work with, that's a fear. You're going to call me a racist, so they won't take the risk.
That's right.
To talk about what they're thinking, to talk about what they were taught. And I share this over and over again. A quote I heard years ago, don't know who said it, that the process is the first part of the product. So we can't have hard conversations. How will we ever get to creating change, dismantling institutional isms in our workplace? So for me, a success is we're talking about it, because we weren't talking about it before. Your workplace was not talking about privilege and bias and all of these ways in which racism shows up. So that's it, talking about it, I would say.
And do you have an example of something that encapsulates this that you so eloquently broke down?
Oh yeah. Oh gosh. Okay. So an example, well, I'll tell you a couple of ways that we measure it. I love it when people are laughing at my jokes, right? When people who were quiet most of the time finally speak up.
Mm-hmm.
We do polls virtually. We do evaluations. When people say a common thing that is said in my evaluations are, I wish we had more time.
Yes.
So most of our workshops are 3 hours, and the leader who hires us will often be like, I don't know if we can do 3 hours. And I'm like, I promise it'll be engaging and interactive. And, we'll do lots of different things. It won't just be me lecturing. And at the end, they'll say, I wish we had more time. right? So that's one indicator that that people are leaning in, I guess.
I had the pleasure of watching your TED Talk, and one of the many gems you shared was pertaining to our differences being what makes us great. And I received recently a word in church where the pastor said, unity not being uniformity, which I feel both play on each other. How do you help people who have a mindset of seeing and embracing what they know or think to being more open to things less familiar to them?
Yeah. So even, let me say, even the conversation around race can be less familiar to them,
Yep.
right? And I will often say in our workshops, I hope you leave here with more questions than you do answers. And then I'll ask them, like, why would I say that?
Mm.
And they'll respond because questions mean we're going to leave and learn and try to learn more, or it means that we're curious, or that we recognize we don't understand certain things, and we'll do the work to figure it out, right? And that's what I want. I want people to be curious, and I want them to ask questions. And if I can model curiosity with them, if I can facilitate, I say if because I'm not always successful, right? I have these core values on Aster, but I'm a person and I get triggered and I don't always do it perfectly. But if I can do that, and if they can have, a successful experience of having conversations in these workshops, then maybe they'll start having the conversation with a friend that they've
Right.
never had it with, right? So I remember one time, I have these stories that, I'll remember that stand out for me. And they usually happen when I work with an organization over time. Somebody will be resistant, often a white participant. I don't know that they're resistant. I always assume there are some people in the workshop resistant, but I don't always know who it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one time, it might have been like the third workshop, this white guy comes to me and he goes, I wasn't happy when you were saying about, that racism is real, and that, we shouldn't operate from colorblind. Every year I go on this fishing trip with, four of my buddies. We're gone for a week, and one of them is Native American. And we've never talked about race. So this was his proof that race was not an issue, because clearly if it was, then my indigenous friend would have brought it up.
Yes, sir.
But
Mhm.
and on this fishing trip during our workshop, and this is why he's telling me this. He said, so I talked to that friend and we had hours of conversation around the racism that he experiences. And I never would have talked with him about it.
Mm.
Not said it. I had asked her, I had a woman say, I'm married to a Korean man. She was upset. She came to class like 2 times. She said, I don't want to talk. She was like taking it in. She said, I don't want to talk. Then finally, this was a student in one of the classes. She said, I'm ready to talk about it. She said she'd never talked to her husband about race. She brings it up to him. So she's just sitting. She's just stewing. She finally talks with him about it. She said it took her relationship to a deeper level.
Love it. Love it. And I think that's such a great segue into, you talk about colorblind thinking, and the early socialization amongst white people. Talk about that, a little bit of that, because I think that's a great segue to exactly what you were just talking about. How many? I mean, to your point, so many times I'm in conversations where people are like, I don't see color, and that's the biggest hurdle to start with. Or, I got a lot of black friends. Yeah, what does that mean? Nobody's doing a favor. Like, so talk about your whole thinking on that, the colorblind thinking, which kind of it was definitely consistent in the story you just walked through.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that colorblind thinking comes from a good place. Like, I
Yeah.
think the intention is good. It's the impact
Right.
that's problematic, right? I don't know when that ideology came about. I know people still use like melting pot, uh, which is again along that kind of colorblind, thinking. I think it derived, my guess would be, maybe after the 60s. And I think white people wanted to convey that they were different from their parents, their grandparents, people who, saw differences and saw them as negative.
Mm-hmm.
So that pendulum then swings in the other direction. So rather than seeing differences as negative, right, segregation, Jim Crow, all of that, that the approaches I know how will be different. We won't notice color, right? And so now what we're trying to help people understand is that we don't want you to see differences as negative, and we also don't want you to pretend that you don't notice.
Well,
That the harder work is in noticing differences, but seeing them as positive. So in my workshop this morning, a guy brought up something that's very common that, and he said it with curiosity, like I was in the military and we were actually taught colorblind thinking that when, not the rubber meets the road, but when we're there's going to be a moment that we have to save each other's lives, and that that we shouldn't see color. And I suggest two things when people bring up the military. One is typically when I talk to people of color, they will tell me about experiences they've had of racism in the military. But what would it look like instead for, I don't know what all the language is, the sergeant or whoever said that, to say, there is a difference, but let's not
allow that
let's
allow that to cloud our mental process.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That no one is inferior because of their differences.
That's right.
And so, but this kind of messaging is all over our society, is that the only way that we are going to kind of be this society that, cares for one another is if we don't notice. And I want you to notice, just like I want you to notice that I'm a woman. You brought up your church. I have a religious identity.
That's right.
I have a gender identity. I have a marriage identity. I have all these identities, and race is a part of it.
That's right.
Right? There's nothing wrong with it. But when we don't notice, one of the messages that we're conveying is that there must be something wrong with being Black. Because if there wasn't, then we'd be honest and say we notice.
Yep. No, listen, you mentioned now and earlier, we're can be such an empathetic people because we've had to persevere and deal with so much, which makes it easier for us to empathize for others, I feel, in certain instances, because we've had to need that for our challenges and struggles. And we're such a welcoming, forgiving, loving people. And I look at your story with your mother, who is white, that you mentioned, raised 6 children alone, while on welfare, 2 of which were mixed, you being one of them. And in the 60s, she met the couple that you were alluding to, Marion and George Simmons, who were Black, had no kids themselves, but provided her with a job at their barbecue restaurant and catering business, correct?
Mm-hmm. Jewish catering
and later, yeah, and you later go on to even call them grandma and grandpa, which they welcomed. And you, I think, obviously take on this superpower of helping others, very similar to that in your purpose-driven work. What do you think is that secret sauce that you're tapping into that also shown to you by your grandparents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in all honesty, and in my mom as well. My mom was a very giving person. Always helped people who were in need, and we just grew up with that in our family. And I'd say one is to see the humanity in one another, right? That to recognize that we all hurt, we all have struggles, though our struggles might be different. I know for me, it was when I started teaching graduate school and my students were predominantly white, that as I began to hear their stories and hearing alcoholism and domestic violence and sexual abuse and, things that I did not experience,
Hmm.
uh, I realized that I was forgetting their pain.
Hmm.
And the challenge I think is that, so I would say, see humanity. And when it comes to race, because racism surfaces guilt and pain, or not guilt and pain, guilt and shame
Shame.
for white people, that it's very hard for them to lean in and be curious about our experiences. The other seed I would say is hope. Like, you can't, like, if you don't have hope, right, then what do we have, right? Like, I am very big on hope, even though I think I'm realistic in what I think is possible right now or within my lifetime. But given our country being so divided and polarized, and the increase or surge in anti-Asian and Black hate, anti-Semitism, the targeting our queer LGBTQ communities. I mean, we're seeing so much of it. We've got to have hope that change will happen. And the other thing is to be a part of that change, that to not just think that your goodness is enough,
Right.
that it requires some action. So take action. So I would say, see each other's humanity, have hope, and do something, right?
Yeah.
To take action.
So that's the secret sauce that you pull from, like you said, your grandparents and your mother. And I love those. And I look at that there's so many things that are constantly evolving, new circumstances that are brought to the table that you probably have to uh, figure out how to speak to. So how do you stay informed about, emerging issues and best practices kind of related to racial justice and equity? And then what does the integration of these elements look like for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I have more books than I can read.
I need to catch up. I'm terrible with reading books. I'm so bad. I need to do more.
Yeah, I love it. So audio. So I do a lot of Audible books. That's how I can get some of them done, and articles. Not a big podcast person, unfortunately. I want to get there, but I'm still 59 almost, right? Like, I
You're
haven't,
doing
like, I
good.
just incorporated that into my learning. But a lot of my learning, if I'm remembering your question, a lot of my learning also comes from the conversations that I'm having,
Mm.
right? Like, personal or in work. I just learning about other people's experiences, times when I've made mistakes, I've offended someone, I've committed a microaggression, and the feedback that they give me, even though I call it a hurt so good moment. Ooh, I don't like that I did that to you, but I'm glad that you told me, because now I have the opportunity to change. But that's how a lot of my learning happens. And I'd say conversations and books. I don't watch the news as much as I should, because the news I don't want it to affect my hope.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So, yeah, my husband, I use him as a filter. So probably several times a week, I will say, what's going on in the news? What
Right.
do I need to read or know about? But
You send him into the fire.
I send him into the fire. Oh, he loves it. So, but it's hard when we're seeing so much hate and our country so divided. And yeah, so
It also confirms even more why your work is so necessary. The only way light really shows is amongst darkness, right? Like light's not going to show in light. So it's essential that that darkness is there, because then it really authenticates even more your work. And I look at cultures connecting and the emphasis you put on the role of individuals as change agents, right? How do you now empower and then support individuals within organizations to take meaningful action towards racial justice after you've kind of worked with them and brought them along?
yeah. Oh, there's so many ways. So one, we might help them with, let's say, like an equity team. They'll name it what they want to, but we very much believe in Glenn Singleton's approach. He wrote a book and coined the term courageous conversations. Equity teams are a group of people that help to lead the work that keep it alive. No one knows the organization more than the people who work there. So
Right.
being an outside consultant, like we can help, we can guide you, but really it's the people within that are going to be able to say, this is the change that needs to happen.
Right.
So we
They know where the
coach.
they know where the bodies are hid as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we coach them, we give them ideas, we might do a retreat with them, help them to think about like things like roles and responsibilities, identify maybe 2 or 3 things that they feel like they can make some change in within the year. We do a lot of leadership coaching, so guiding behind the scenes with people in the kind of C-suite level who you know uh, need some guidance. Things happen; they're not sure what to do. They were taught to lead this way. What might leading look like in this particular situation? Some strategic planning. Often we don't do a lot of like assessing, or but we might help a group do a strategic plan or help them work on a couple of areas and create some subcommittees. But we're really trying to help organizations develop an equity lens so that they can lead the work. Right? We don't want them working with us
Mm.
forever. We want them to have the lens so that they're seeing where change needs to happen. And a lot of that is through professional development and consulting and coaching.
Gotcha. And so looking ahead,
Yeah.
I was just to say, so looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing challenges and opportunities in the field of racial justice?
You know, I would say one of the big challenges is the far right
Mm.
politically taking whatever progress that is happening and and bringing it to a stop. Where we see companies like I was reading about REI last week, the clothing company, and they got blasted around language they're using around privilege, and um, they twist it. I've had this happen to me before. Someone will come to my workshop, they'll turn off the camera, then they'll be videotaping me, they'll send it to Jason Rance. That piece will get blown up, then they'll twist the language and be like, look what they're saying,
Yep.
you know. And then what this is where it gets stopped though, because I used to be the director of Seattle Public Schools. I'm of equity and race department. I'm familiar with all that. Where it gets stopped is that leaders cower. Is that the right word? Like they get frightened and they're like, okay, we don't want this heat. And so then they cave in and they get rid of that DEI director. Just saw this happening in the news yesterday.
Multiple companies.
Yeah.
Multiple companies. So
Yeah, it's happening all the time. And so it's that's one of the challenges. I mean, work has definitely slowed down for us. I mean, I'm still busy, but when George Floyd was murdered and we all witnessed that, right? Like we were getting so many calls, right? It was like
it was
drinking
it was
water out of a
it was the cool thing. It was on everybody's desk. It was the thing, the conversation by the cooler. It was everything that these companies now felt obligated to respond to. And now you are bringing us something that is a major, major concern of all the companies, institutions that are doing away with DE&I. And they're not doing it for the purpose of, people ask me what does success look like for diversity and inclusion. I say, well, when you don't have to have these departments or these people in these roles anymore. And I'm not saying that that's the reason why they're doing that right now. It's the actual complete opposite. They're doing it
right.
because of the fear, the ego, the lack of wanting to do the real work. And they are tired, I think, of having the pressure or the accountability to do the work. So they're doing away with it totally without actually helping to solve the problem. Now they're making it a bigger problem than what it was probably before.
Yeah. So I think you named it. So it's wherever the pressure is. So if the pressure is to do it, we're going to do it. If there's pressure to not do it, we're not going to do it. And what's missing is they don't really understand the why for this work, right? They've not really done any work to be committed, so that no matter what pressure they experience from either side, they're doing what they believe is the right thing to do for the good of the people that work for that company and for the people that they serve, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as they don't know what their why is, this is the whole first part of my book, Inside Out, right? It's called, horrible title, by the way, Oster, because that's a Disney movie,
Yeah,
right? So,
a great,
oops.
great,
Okay.
great movie.
But yeah, but the idea, great book too. And the idea is that, again, part of it talks about you need to know what your why
That's
is,
right.
because you will get hit. You can be doing the right thing, and even people of color can get upset with you. And if you don't know why this work is important or what it's going to do for you or for your organization, for your community, or for our country, you're going to go whichever way the wind blows. And unfortunately, a lot of people, as you said, when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of people felt pressure rather than really thinking about or wanting to lean into figuring out, like, so why do we need to do this? Because it wasn't just about George Floyd's murder, and his
Right.
murder wasn't the first, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that stop and start.
Yeah. I always say a dear friend shared this: when you know your why, you never lose your way. When you know your why, you never lose your way. And you just, again, confirmed that notion, and that when you don't know your why, any road is going to lead you any and everywhere. So I love how you shared that. So now the documentary for Caprice is coming out. The life story. Come on, come and listen. It's coming. And it's the opening scene, your life documentary. What song is playing and why?
Oh my gosh, when you set it up that way. You know, I'm going to tell you a song that I hold on to. And I don't know if it has anything to do with the stage you just set for this, but I'm going to tell you, it's a song, and I don't know who sings it because I'm horrible with names and actors and singers,
Okay.
but it's a Christian song, and it's You Know My Name.
Oh, yes.
Do you know who sings that?
We're going to find
It's a woman.
why, and give the reason why you do that.
Because things get really hard, and I make mistakes, and I don't always show up in a way that aligns with my core values, that I get triggered. And I always say that I hate that sometimes my learning comes at somebody else's expense, right? And for me, it's that no matter what I do or how I show up, that God knows me. Like, he knows my heart. He knows what I'm trying to do. He knows my humanness. And that even when other people can't give me grace, and there's lots of reasons. Some people, me hurting them is, not the first time, but many times.
That's right.
That he gives me grace.
Grace.
And as long as I can as long as I have grace, and that somebody knows, like, at my deepest core,
your intentions, your good intentions, and God knows, because you are a vessel of God's word.
Yeah. He knows what I'm trying to do. And the only hesitation, Aster, that I have around, even as you summarized it with my good intentions, I wasn't really thinking of intentions, but just kind of like, he knows who I am, right? And I'm an instrument, I think, of his works. And I don't, always do that well. Is that a lot of times in cross-cultural interactions, white people will create these cultural norms or what have you of assume positive intent. And what I try to get people to focus on is, yes, it matters if you intended to do harm or not,
Right.
But what is more important is your impact.
Mm.
And because in the impact is the conversation. In the impact is the accountability. In the impact is the possibility of the person who did the harm changing. And as long as we focus on intent, then the person who was harmed always has to do the work, right? Of assuming that you meant well, and so there's no learning and there's no conversation. But anyway, that was just a thought. So that's the song.
And,
I don't know if it's
oh, and
the moment I get on stage.
Tasha Combs Leonard. Tasha.
Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Cobbs. Tasha Cobbs. Yes.
Tasha Cobbs. Thank you. Tasha Cobbs.
Yeah.
So that is a beautiful song, which very, very familiar. And I love that that's the opening scene to your documentary. So, we always end these conversations as you talk about, your hope for a better tomorrow. What are the 3 seeds you would want to leave with the stewards of culture moving forward?
I would say it's not if you're going to offend, but when. So don't let your fear of offending or making mistakes get in the way of you trying new things.
Love that.
I would say this work is a journey, not an event. So commit to the long haul. And that as another seed I would give is this work is a way of being. It's not a hat that we put on or take off. It's about how we show up in relationship to other people who are different from us. And that's in all aspects of our lives. So to, practice, becoming a better version of who you were, yesterday or the day before. And think about that when you're in the grocery store and you see something happening, or in your church or place of worship or in your community. It's not just something that's in the workplace. Now we're doing this work. This is
the lifestyle, who we are.
So
It's who we are. And as I listen to you talk, I'm just so thankful that God is using you in this space. And I will pray that he gives you the resiliency, the perseverance, and the focus to continue to do this great work, knowing your heart, knowing the place in which you are coming from, and knowing how needed your voice is, because you are the minority, literally and figuratively, right? That does not mean that you don't have the majority to offer, which is so key. And for that, I want to thank you for your work and your time.
Aster, thank you for inviting me on your show. This was awesome. It was great getting to meet you and talk with you. And we're just a border away, right? We're just we're right next to each other. So who knows when we'll have the opportunity for our paths to cross. And I hope some of your listeners will go to Cultures Connecting or my company and join our mailing list, maybe get my book, Inside Out, an Equity Leader's Guide to Undoing Institutional Racism. So many resources out there. And I'm grateful to you and the work that you do to magnify people's voices in these important issues.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
We truly appreciate your support because it helps us fulfill our mission of promoting cultural awareness and personal development. Please click the subscribe button below to help ensure and solidify our mission.